In Caesar's Palace Grand Arena, a cocky young fighter was about to turn a showcase into a showdown. A glittering martial arts exhibition turned deadly serious when Joe Louis mocked tradition and taunted legends. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical Hollywood star. For decades, he had been a world karate champion and a decorated U.S. Air Force veteran, known for delivering the spinning back kick that left entire tournaments trembling. When Joe Louis called him out in front of thousands, he had no idea he was stepping into the ring with a man who had turned combat into instinct. Norris answered with one perfectly timed strike that would trigger a transformation greater than the crowd expected. What began as a young fighter's ego trip would become a lesson in humility. The Las Vegas crowd would never be the same after watching arrogance collapse against mastery in a single heartbeat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Caesar's Palace Grand Arena pulsed with electricity on that summer night in 1983. Las Vegas had seen its share of spectacles, heavyweight title fights, comeback concerts, million-dollar poker showdowns, but the International Martial Arts Exhibition promised something different, something primal. An arena filled with 3,000 bodies leaned forward in anticipation, their collective energy almost tangible in the air. The announcer, a barrel-chested man with a voice that could rattle the chandeliers, stood center stage, microphone gripped tight. Behind him, a massive banner stretched across the arena. East meets West, legends of the fighting arts. Beneath it, fighters from across the world warmed up in the shadows. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer's voice thundered through the speakers. Welcome to the greatest gathering of martial arts masters ever assembled under one roof. The crowd roared back, a wave of sound crashing against the walls. Camera flashes sparked like lightning throughout the darkened stands. Reporters from Sports Illustrated, Black Belt Magazine, and a dozen international publications scribbled notes, capturing the electricity of the moment. In the front row, almost invisible despite his prime position, sat Chuck Norris. At 43, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. His hands rested lightly on his knees, still calloused from decades of training. The warm golden lights of the arena caught the reddish tint in his beard, the only feature that suggested his age. Unlike the other celebrities who had arrived with entourages and photographers, Chuck had slipped in quietly, nodding respectfully to the fighters and fans who recognized him. 3 seats down, Master Tanaka, a 70-year-old karate pioneer who had trained champions across 5 decades, noticed Chuck's arrival. Their eyes met briefly. No words. Just a slight bow of mutual respect between two men who had dedicated their lives to the same disciplines. Tanaka's weathered face carried the map of every fight he'd witnessed, every student he'd trained. Tonight, he sensed something significant brewing beneath the spectacle. Tonight's exhibition brings together Olympic champions, grand masters, and the brightest young talents in martial arts today. The announcer paused dramatically, letting anticipation build. Legends will be tested. Reputations will be made. Or broken. The lights dimmed suddenly, plunging the arena into darkness, except for a single spotlight that cut through the center like a laser. The crowd hushed in anticipation. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the man everyone's talking about. The phenomenon from Philadelphia with 15 consecutive knockouts, the fighter who redefined what speed means in the ring. Joe Louis! Music exploded through the speakers. Van Halen's Jump at deafening volume as a second spotlight swept across the entrance tunnel. A figure emerged, arms raised triumphantly before he'd even faced an opponent. Joe Louis strode toward the ring with the confidence of a conquering emperor, gold-trimmed robe flowing behind him like a cape. At 28, he embodied explosive power. 6 foot, two of sculpted muscle, moving with predatory grace. The crowd's reaction split instantly. Half rose to their feet, punching the air and chanting his name. The other half, mostly older practitioners and traditionalists, remained seated. Their silence, a counterpoint to the frenzy. Joe fed on both reactions equally. He climbed into the ring with a fluid vault over the top rope, then spun in a full circle, drinking in the arena's energy. His smile flashed white against his tan, part movie star charm, part predator's warning. He shrugged off his robe to reveal a physique that belonged on a Greek statue, every muscle defined under the bright lights. 15 fights, 15 knockouts, the announcer continued. The fastest rising star in full-contact karate. The man who's promised to revolutionize martial arts for a new generation. Joe snatched the microphone from the announcer's hand. Revolutionize? His voice carried the rasp of Philadelphia streets beneath its practiced smoothness. I'm not revolutionizing anything. I'm just exposing the frauds. He paced the ring like a caged tiger. Half the masters here tonight learned their moves from books and meditation. I learned mine by breaking jaws. A mixture of cheers and boos cascaded down. Joe drank it in, grinning wider. Tonight, he continued, I'm here to separate the real fighters from the phonies. The men from the boys. The fighters from the actors. At this last word, his eyes flicked momentarily toward Chuck Norris. So quick was the glance that many missed it. But Master Tanaka caught it immediately. He glanced at Chuck, whose expression remained unchanged, impassive, watching. But the subtle tightening around his eyes suggested he'd caught the reference as well. Joe handed the microphone back, rolling his shoulders and bouncing on the balls of his feet as the announcer introduced his opponent for the first exhibition match, a respected Korean master visiting from Seoul. The older man climbed into the ring with dignified precision, bowing to the four corners of the arena before taking his position. In his seat, Chuck watched with focused attention. He had faced hundreds of opponents across his career, from bare-knuckle tournaments in Texas to championship bouts in Tokyo. He recognized the look in Joe Louis's eyes, the raw hunger, the need to prove something that went beyond mere victory. It was a look he had seen in the mirror. Once, many years ago, before he had learned what true strength meant. The bell rang, sharp and clear above the crowd's murmur. Across the ring, two philosophies prepared to clash. One built on flash and dominance, the other on tradition and discipline. But beneath the surface spectacle, something more significant was taking shape. A confrontation between two visions of what it meant to be powerful, to be respected, to be a warrior. Chuck settled deeper into his seat. The night was young, and Las Vegas had always been a city where legends were made and broken in the span of a single evening. The Korean master moved with the fluid precision of decades of training. His stance was textbook perfect. Hands positioned to guard vital points. Weight balanced to shift in any direction. At 52, Master Hyun Jung-gil carried the quiet dignity of a man who had trained champions across 3 continents. The wrinkles at the corners of his eyes deepened as he sized up his younger opponent. Joe Louis circled him like a shark, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet. Begin! The referee stepped back, and the exhibition match officially started. Master Hyun moved first, a traditional approach designed to test his opponent's defenses. His front kick snapped out with surprising speed for a man his age, aimed precisely at Joe's midsection. Joe didn't just block it, he caught the older man's ankle with insulting ease, held it for a theatrical moment, then pushed it away with a smirk. "That all you got, old man?" he said, loud enough for the front rows to hear. Master Hyun's expression didn't change. He reset his stance and circled cautiously. In the front row, Master Tanaka leaned slightly toward Chuck. "The young one has talent," he murmured, his Japanese accent still thick despite decades in America. Chuck nodded almost imperceptibly. "Tremendous talent," he agreed quietly. "Shame about everything else." Back in the ring, Joe had decided playtime was over. He exploded forward with a combination that seemed to defy physics, a jab that became a hook that flowed into a spinning back kick, all executed with mechanical precision. Master Hyun blocked the first two moves but caught the kick square in the ribs. The impact echoed through the arena, followed by a collective gasp. The older fighter stumbled back, momentarily winded. Professional that he was, he recovered his stance. But something had shifted. A flash of uncertainty crossed his face. Not fear, but the recognition that he was outmatched in raw speed and power. Joe saw it too. His smile widened, becoming predatory. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're witnessing the clash of generations," the announcer's voice boomed. "The traditional master against the new breed of fighter." Joe pressed his advantage, launching a blistering series of combinations. His movements held nothing of traditional kata. This was street-effective brutality refined to an art form. Each strike flowed into the next with fluid grace, creating an overwhelming offensive wave. Master Hyun defended valiantly, his technique still precise, but he was being driven backward, step by step. The difference in speed was telling Joe seemed to move in fast forward, while the rest of the world operated at normal speed. "Look at that footwork, ladies and gentlemen!" The announcer could barely contain his excitement. "Lewis is revolutionizing how we think about fighting distance." In the front row, Chuck watched with professional appreciation, despite his distaste for Joe's attitude. The young fighter's technical ability was undeniable, the way he chained combinations, his timing, the explosive power generated from perfect biomechanics. Whatever else Joe Lewis might be, he was a genuine prodigy in the ring. Midway through the round, Joe slipped inside Master Hyun's guard and delivered a punishing body shot that made the older man wince visibly. Instead of pressing the advantage immediately, Joe stepped back, grinning at the crowd, playing to the cameras. "He's toying with him," Master Tanaka murmured, disapproval evident in his tone. Chuck's expression darkened slightly. Competitive fighting was one thing, humiliation was another. Joe circled his opponent, now openly taunting. "Come on, master," he called out, emphasizing the title with subtle mockery. "Show me one of those secret techniques." He bounced exaggeratedly, imitating traditional stances with exaggerated movements that drew laughs from his supporters in the crowd. Master Hyun maintained his dignity, refusing to be baited. He launched a counter-offensive, a perfectly executed combination that had won him championships in his prime. For a moment, it seemed to catch Joe by surprise, a straight punch slipping past his guard to glance off his cheek. A hush fell over the arena. First blood drawn. Joe touched his face, looked at his fingertips, then laughed, a sound utterly devoid of humor. His eyes narrowed, and the playfulness vanished, replaced by cold focus. What followed was no longer an exhibition. Joe unleashed a combination of devastating power, moving so quickly his limbs blurred under the bright lights. A front kick to create distance, followed by a flying knee that Master Hyun barely blocked, finishing with a roundhouse kick that connected with surgical precision against the older man's temple. Master Hyun crumpled to the canvas. The referee jumped between them immediately, waving his arms to signal the match was over. Medical staff rushed into the ring while the crowd erupted, half in wild cheers, half in stunned silence. "That was unnecessary," Master Tanaka said, quietly, his weathered hands tightening on his knees. Chuck didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on Joe, who was parading around the ring, arms raised in triumph, playing to the cameras as medics attended to the fallen master. "Ladies and gentlemen, the winner by knockout, Joe Louis." The announcer's voice barely carried over the noise of the crowd. Joe grabbed the microphone again. "That's how we do it in Philly," he shouted. "No meditation, no mystical energy, no movie magic, just real fighting." His supporters roared their approval while others sat in uncomfortable silence. Master Hyun was helped to his feet, wobbling slightly but conscious. A true professional. He bowed to Joe despite everything. Joe gave a perfunctory nod in return, already focused on the crowd's adoration. "Anyone else want to test their ancient wisdom against modern reality?" Joe challenged, scanning the arena. His eyes swept past Chuck Norris, then snapped back, lingering this time. A new smile spread across his face, the smile of a man who has just spotted a bigger trophy. In that moment, something shifted in the arena's atmosphere. The exhibition matches were supposed to be demonstrations of skill, of mutual respect between different styles. Joe had turned it into something else, a gladiatorial spectacle, a platform for his ego. "Who's next?" Joe demanded, still holding the microphone. "I came here to face the best, not these relics living on reputation." His eyes remained fixed on Chuck, the invitation unmistakable. Chuck maintained his calm, meeting Joe's gaze steadily, but making no move to respond to the implied challenge. Joe handed the microphone back to the announcer and strutted toward his corner, where his team draped a towel over his shoulders and handed him water. He made a show of barely being winded, of being ready for more. The medical team helped Master Hyun from the ring. As he passed Chuck's seat, the older fighter paused, leaning down slightly. "Be careful with that one," he said softly. "He fights not to win, but to hurt." Chuck nodded, respect in his eyes. "Rest well, Master. You fought with honor." As Master Hyun was led away, the announcer returned to center ring. "Ladies and gentlemen, what a start to our evening. But we're just getting warmed up. Our next exhibition features—" Joe interrupted, crossing the ring to snatch the microphone again. The announcer, caught off guard, relinquished it without resistance. "Hold up," Joe said, his voice cutting through the arena. "I think the people want something more exciting than the scheduled program." He turned slowly, making sure every camera could capture his profile. "I see we have some celebrities in attendance tonight, including one who's made quite a career playing tough guys on the big screen." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd as people followed Joe's gaze toward Chuck Norris. In the front row, Chuck remained still, his expression unchanged, but something had shifted in his eyes, a focus that hadn't been there before, sharp as a blade's edge. "What do you say, Chuck?" Joe called out, his voice echoing through the arena. "Want to show these people what you can do in a real fight? No stunt doubles? No second takes?" The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric gasps, then scattered applause, building into competing chants. "Joe! Joe! Joe!" from one section, answered by "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" from another. The promoter rushed to the edge of the ring, frantically signaling for Joe to stop. This wasn't part of the program, wasn't cleared by any athletic commission. But Joe ignored him, playing to the crowd, to the cameras, to his own swelling ego. "Come on, Chuck," he pressed, voice dripping with mock respect. "Your movies are entertaining. But some of us wonder if you remember what a real fight feels like." In the sudden spotlight of attention, Chuck Norris remained seated, outwardly calm. But those who knew him well, like Master Tanaka beside him, recognized the subtle signs. The slight straightening of his spine, the almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes. The gauntlet had been thrown down in front of thousands. And despite his calm exterior, Chuck Norris had never been a man to walk away from a challenge. The arena held its collective breath. 3,000 people, moments ago lost in their individual experiences, now shared a single focus: the motionless figure of Chuck Norris in the front row, and the grinning provocateur standing in the ring above him. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "What's the matter, Chuck?" Joe called out, circling the ring like a carnival barker. "Worried about fighting without a script?" He played to the crowd, drawing a mix of laughs and uncomfortable murmurs. Chuck remained seated, his expression unreadable. Decades of discipline had taught him to control his reactions, to never let an opponent sense anger or hesitation. But the slight tension in his jaw betrayed the internal calculus taking place, weighing professionalism against pride, public perception against private principle. Master Tanaka leaned closer. "You do not need to answer this challenge," he said softly. "It is beneath you." But both men knew that wasn't entirely true. In the world of martial arts, respect was currency, and challenges unanswered could devalue a lifetime of achievement. Especially with cameras rolling, journalists scribbling, and thousands watching. The announcer tried to regain control, stepping toward Joe with his hand extended for the microphone. "Let's continue with our scheduled program." Joe ignored him, keeping the microphone and his focus on Chuck. "I get it. It's different when it's not choreographed, right? When the other guy isn't paid to make you look good?" His smile widened. "Tell you what, I'll even let you throw the first punch. Just like in your movies." The taunt hung in the air, sharp and pointed. In his seat, Chuck remained still for another long moment. Then, with deliberate calm, he stood. The simple act sent a ripple through the crowd, whispers cascaded through the stands, cameras swiveled, and the energy in the room transformed instantly. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" The chant began somewhere in the back and spread like wildfire. Chuck removed his jacket, a simple black blazer over a crisp white shirt, and handed it to Master Tanaka, who accepted it with a solemn nod. No words passed between them, but an understanding did. Some challenges couldn't be ignored, not without surrendering something essential. The promoter rushed to Chuck's side, speaking urgently. "This isn't sanctioned. The insurance doesn't cover impromptu matches. The commission will—" Chuck raised a hand, silencing him with quiet authority. "It's an exhibition," he said simply. "No different than what was planned." His voice was surprisingly soft for a man of his reputation, measured, controlled, with the slight Texas drawl he had never entirely shed. The promoter looked ready to object further, but something in Chuck's expression stopped him. Instead, he nodded reluctantly and stepped back. Chuck walked toward the ring with unhurried confidence. Every step was measured, balanced the walk of a man who had spent his life mastering the mechanics of his own body. He didn't play to the crowd or acknowledge the cameras. His focus remained entirely on Joe Louis, who stood in the center of the ring, still smirking. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice cut through the building noise, professional instinct taking over despite his obvious surprise. "It appears we have an unscheduled exhibition. Chuck Norris has accepted Joe Louis's challenge." The crowd erupted. People who had been seated jumped to their feet. Those already standing pressed closer to the ring. Security guards moved to maintain order as the excitement threatened to boil over. Chuck climbed into the ring with the same efficiency that characterized all his movements, no wasted energy, no theatrical flourish. He simply ascended the steps, ducked between the ropes, and stood. Up close, the contrast between the two men became more pronounced. Joe was younger, taller, more obviously muscled, a specimen built for showcasing physical dominance. Chuck was compact, efficient in his construction. The definition in his forearms and the thickness of his neck, the only obvious tells of his power. Joe bounced on his toes, constantly in motion. Chuck stood centered, perfectly still. "I didn't think you'd actually do it," Joe said, handing the microphone back to the announcer but pitching his voice to Carrie. "Guess there's more fight in you than I thought." Chuck didn't respond. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his shirt and waited. The referee, caught unprepared by this development, looked uncertainly between the fighters and the promoter before climbing hesitantly into the ring. He beckoned both men to the center. "This is an exhibition match only," he emphasized, looking particularly at Joe. "Full contact is permitted, but I will stop the action at my discretion." "Clear?" Joe nodded impatiently. Chuck gave a single, precise nod. "Touch gloves and return to your corners," the referee instructed. Joe extended his hand with a theatrical flourish. "No hard feelings when this is over. Right? Just business." Chuck touched gloves briefly, his expression unchanged. He turned and walked to the far corner, rolling his shoulders once to loosen them, the only preparation he seemed to need. In the front row, Master Tanaka watched with the focus of a man who had seen 1,000 fights and could predict the flow of combat from the smallest tells. What he saw concerned him. Joe was young, powerful, riding a wave of victories. Chuck was in his 40s. Years removed from competitive fighting, known now more for his movies than his martial arts. And yet, there was something in Chuck's posture, in the absolute stillness of his waiting, that gave the old master pause. He had seen such stillness before. In the most dangerous fighters, he had ever encountered men who had moved beyond technique into the realm of instinct, whose bodies responded without the delay of thought. The referee raised his hand, looking between the two fighters. The arena quieted to a tense hush. "Begin!" Joe didn't waste a second. He exploded forward with a blistering combination jab. Cross. Hook. Designed to overwhelm, to establish dominance immediately. His form was flawless, each punch flowing into the next with practiced precision. His speed startling, even to those who had seen him fight before. Chuck didn't retreat. He didn't even seem to block in the conventional sense. He simply wasn't where the punches landed. Minimal movements, a slight shift of weight, a small turn of the shoulder caused Joe's attacks to miss by millimeters. Not flashy evasions, but tiny calibrations of distance that made Joe's offensive barrage hit nothing but air. The crowd, expecting either a dramatic exchange or Chuck being overwhelmed, instead witnessed something more subtle. The complete negation of aggression through perfect defensive timing. Joe's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to the first flicker of frustration. He reset and launched another combination, faster this time, adding a kick to change levels. Again, Chuck moved just enough to avoid damage, economical in his defense, nothing wasted. "Fight back!" Joe demanded, loud enough for the first several rows to hear. He punctuated the demand with a roundhouse kick that would have taken a lesser fighter's head off. Chuck caught the kick against his forearm, absorbing the impact without giving ground. For the briefest moment, the two men were frozen in tableau. Joe extended in attack, Chuck solid in defense. Then Chuck released the leg and stepped back, resuming his ready position. Still, he hadn't thrown a single strike. "Is this how you do it in your movies?" Joe taunted, circling now, looking for openings. "Bore your opponent to death?" If the words affected Chuck, he showed no sign. His focus remained absolute, his breathing controlled, his eyes tracking Joe's every movement with laser precision. In the crowd, the initial excitement began to transform into something more complex. Those who had come for blood and spectacle grew restless, But others, particularly the martial artists present, leaned forward with growing appreciation. They were witnessing a masterclass in economy of motion, in the highest principle of self-defense, control without aggression. Master Tanaka allowed himself a small smile. Chuck was fighting, just not in the way Joe or most of the audience understood fighting. He was demonstrating the principle that had guided true masters for centuries. The perfect fight was one where victory was achieved with minimal exertion against maximal aggression. Joe, sensing the shift in the crowd's energy, doubled down. His next attack was his most aggressive, yet a flying knee, followed by a spinning back fist. Techniques that had rendered opponents unconscious in previous fights. Techniques that should have been impossible to defend against completely. Chuck slipped the knee, blocked the back fist with his forearm, and for the first time, countered a single straight punch to Joe's solar plexus, delivered with such perfect timing that it landed between heartbeats. The impact wasn't visually dramatic. No Hollywood exaggeration, no flying backward across the ring. Just the sudden expulsion of air from Joe's lungs, the momentary widening of his eyes, and the instinctive step backward. The crowd responded with a collective gasp, followed by a building cheer. Not for the spectacle of the counter, but for its perfect execution, like watching a surgeon make a single, precise incision. Joe recovered quickly, but something fundamental had changed. The smirk was gone, replaced by a tightening around the eyes, a clenching of the jaw. For the first time that night, perhaps for the first time in years, Joe Louis faced the unfamiliar sensation of doubt. He reset his stance, more cautious now, studying Chuck with newfound respect mingled with growing frustration. The fight had just begun, but already the narrative was shifting from the young lion challenging the aging star to something more complex, more primal. In the front row, Master Tanaka nodded slowly to himself. This was no longer an exhibition or a response to a challenge. It had become a demonstration of philosophical difference. Flash versus function, arrogance versus mastery, youth versus experience. And everyone in the arena could sense which philosophy was beginning to prevail. The arena's atmosphere had transformed completely. What began as entertainment had evolved into something approaching reverence, the collective recognition that they were witnessing not just a fight, but a manifestation of opposing philosophies made physical. Joe Louis stalked the ring with renewed focus. All traces of showmanship gone. The smirk that had been his trademark throughout the night had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped determination. This was no longer about putting on a show or embarrassing a movie star. It had become a fight for his identity, for the validation of everything he believed about himself. Across from him, Chuck Norris maintained his centered calm. His breathing remained even, his stance balanced and ready. Nothing in his demeanor suggested exertion or concern, despite facing an opponent 15 years his junior and at the peak of physical prime. In the front row, Master Tanaka leaned forward slightly, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "Now, we see the true test," he murmured to himself. "When the performer must become the warrior." The arena lights cast dramatic shadows across the canvas as the two fighters circled each other. The crowd had fallen into an almost reverent hush, punctuated only by the occasional camera flash and the soft shuffle of the fighters' feet. Everyone sensed the shift. This was no longer spectacle, but something more profound. Joe attacked again, but with a noticeable change in approach. Gone were the flashy combinations designed as much for the audience as for effectiveness. His techniques became more direct, more functional jabs, designed to test distance, feints to probe defenses. He fought now like a man who had remembered the fundamentals beneath the flash. Chuck responded in kind, his movements minimalist but perfectly timed. He slipped a jab by millimeters, blocked a cross with his forearm, and countered with a short hook that caught Joe on the shoulder, not a damaging blow, but a reminder of vulnerability. "Look at that adjustment by Lewis," the announcer commented, his voice carrying over the crowd's focused silence. "He's abandoned the flashy attacks for more traditional technique." In the press section, journalists typed furiously, already composing the narrative that would fill tomorrow's sports pages. "Humbled champion. Learns mid-fight. Norris teaches masterclass in ring efficiency." Joe pressed forward with renewed determination, cutting off the ring to prevent Chuck from maintaining distance. It was a veteran move, showing a tactical awareness that had been obscured by his earlier showmanship. He launched a combination jab, cross, uppercut executed with textbook precision. Chuck parried the jab, slipped the cross, and caught the uppercut on his forearm. The exchange looked simple to casual observers, but the martial artists present recognized the extraordinary timing required to neutralize such a well-executed combination. The fighters reset, circling each other with newfound mutual respect. Something had shifted in their dynamic from antagonism to recognition. Even Joe could feel it, the grudging acknowledgement that he faced a different caliber of opponent than he had anticipated. A sports photographer at ringside captured the moment Joe's face, showing the first traces of genuine respect. Chuck's expression remaining impassive, but somehow conveying absolute focus. The image would appear on the cover of Black Belt magazine the following month, captioned simply, "The Moment of Truth." Joe feinted a jab, then shifted weight to launch a roundhouse kick to Chuck's midsection. The technique was crisp, efficient, the kind of kick that had dropped opponents in championship bouts. Chuck responded with a subtle weight shift, a slight angling of his body, that caused the kick to miss by the narrowest margin. In the same motion, he delivered a counterpunch to Joe's floating ribs, not with power meant to damage, but with precision meant to educate. The impact was minimal, but Joe's eyes widened slightly at the perfect timing. He had never faced someone who could read his intentions with such clarity, who could respond with such economy of motion. "Incredible defensive awareness from Norris," the announcer observed, his voice carrying the tension of the moment. "He's making the smallest possible movements to avoid Lewis's attacks." In the front row, a young martial arts student leaned toward his instructor. "Why doesn't Norris attack more? He's just defending." The instructor, a weathered veteran of countless tournaments, shook his head slightly. "Watch closely. He's not just defending. He's controlling the fight through defense, making Lewis work twice as hard for half the result." Back in the ring, Joe reset his stance, a new wariness evident in his posture. For the first time in his professional career, he faced an opponent who couldn't be overwhelmed with speed or power, who couldn't be baited with taunts, who couldn't be intimidated with aggression. The experience was unsettling, like suddenly finding yourself speaking a language you thought you had mastered, only to discover depths of nuance you never knew existed. Chuck maintained his position, centered and balanced. His expression revealed nothing, but his eyes tracked Joe's every micro-movement. The slight shift of weight from heel to toe, the almost imperceptible tensing of shoulder muscles before a punch, the subtle tells that telegraphed intention before action. "He's reading him like a book," Master Tanaka murmured, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "The young one is an open page to him." Joe launched another attack, a combination designed to force Chuck to commit to a defense, creating an opening for a finishing blow. Jab, cross, hook, leg kick, each technique flowing into the next, with the fluidity that had made Joe famous. The sequence was beautiful in its execution, combining raw athleticism with fighting intelligence. Chuck's response was equally beautiful, but in a different way. Not through spectacular movement, but through its absence. He slipped the jab with a slight head movement, parried the cross with minimal contact, ducked under the hook, and checked the leg kick with a small lift of his own leg. Each defensive move created a potential counter, though Chuck executed only one, a straight punch to the sternum that landed as Joe's kick missed its target. Again, the punch carried just enough force to make its point without causing damage. It was the martial equivalent of a professor's correction, not a rebuke, but an education. Joe stepped back, frustration flickering across his features. He had thrown his best combination, the sequence that had won him championships, and had connected with nothing but air while absorbing a perfectly timed counter. The experience was disorienting, challenging everything he believed about his fighting prowess. A beat of silence fell over the arena as the two fighters assessed each other. In that moment of stillness, the contrast between them became most apparent. Joe slightly winded, sweat glistening on his forehead. Stance still dynamic, but showing the first signs of fatigue. Chuck composed, breathing controlled, posture unchanged from the beginning of the match. Look at the difference in energy expenditure, a veteran coach commented to his colleagues at ringside. Lewis has thrown twice as many techniques and landed nothing. Norris has thrown a quarter as many and landed every one. Joe took a deep breath, centering himself. Something was shifting in his understanding, not just of this fight, but of fighting itself. He had built his career on the belief that victory came through domination, through overwhelming force and speed. Now he faced an opponent who operated from an entirely different principle, that true mastery lay not in how much energy you expended, but in how little you needed to. With renewed focus, Joe launched a more measured attack. A probing jab followed by a feint, testing Chuck's reactions, rather than committing fully. It was the approach of a strategist rather than a performer, showing an adaptability that had been obscured by his usual showmanship. Chuck nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, a gesture of approval for the adjustment. He responded with equivalent precision, blocking the jab and reading the feint without overcommitting. Their exchange became more measured, more technical, a conversation between fighters rather than a performance for the audience. The crowd sensed the shift, their energy changing from bloodlust to appreciation. Many leaned forward in their seats, martial artists and casual viewers alike, drawn into the subtle interplay of action and reaction, attack and defense, that was unfolding before them. "We're witnessing something special here," the announcer said, his voice quieter now, respectful of the moment. Two completely different approaches to fighting, meeting in the middle. In the press section, a veteran sports journalist who had covered everything from heavyweight title fights to Olympic finals leaned toward his colleague. "I've never seen anything quite like this," he admitted. "It's like watching a debate between philosophies, but with fists instead of words." Joe, sensing the need to change dynamics, executed a sudden burst of speed, a flying knee followed by a spinning elbow. Techniques designed to break through methodical defense with sheer athleticism and unpredictability. It was a calculated risk, leaving him vulnerable if it failed, but potentially devastating if it succeeded. The move was executed flawlessly, with the explosiveness that had defined Joe's rise through the ranks. For a heartbeat, it seemed Chuck might be caught by the unexpected shift in tactics. Instead, he responded with the move that had made him famous in competitive fighting before his Hollywood career, the spinning back kick. Not the theatrical version from his movies, but the functional original, compact, explosive, perfectly timed. The kick intercepted Joe's advance at precisely the right moment, catching him in the midsection as he committed to his attack. The impact halted Joe's momentum completely. He staggered back, breath exploding from his lungs, eyes widening with shock more than pain. The crowd erupted, thousands rising to their feet as one. "Incredible!" the announcer shouted over the noise. "Norris counters with his signature technique." For a moment, Joe appeared genuinely shaken, not physically, though the kick had been solid. But psychologically, he had thrown his most dynamic attack, the combination that no previous opponent had been able to counter. And Chuck had not only defended against it, but had turned it against him with devastating efficiency. Chuck resumed his ready position, no triumph in his expression, no playing to the crowd's reaction. For him, the exchange had been nothing personal, simply the logical response to the presented attack, the physics of combat expressed through trained reflexes. Joe recovered his balance, his expression a complex mixture of emotions: frustration, respect, determination. He had felt the power behind the kick, controlled though it was. He understood now what he was facing. Not an aging star trading on past glory, but a man who had internalized his art so completely that it had become inseparable from his being. The dynamics of the fight had shifted irrevocably. Joe had entered the ring believing himself the superior fighter, certain that Chuck's reputation rested more on Hollywood magic than real skill. That certainty had evaporated, replaced by the humbling recognition that he faced a master operating from a level of understanding he had not yet reached. 90 seconds remaining in the round, the announcer called out. In those 90 seconds lay the opportunity for Joe to salvage his pride, to prove himself worthy of sharing the ring with a legend. But something had changed in his approach. The desperate need to dominate had been replaced by a more mature desire to learn, to test himself against genuine excellence. With newfound focus, Joe reset his stance, his expression betraying the internal shift. The smirk that had defined his public persona was gone, replaced by the concentrated focus of a true fighter. He attacked again, but with a different quality. Now each technique thrown not for the audience, but for himself, for the integrity of his art. Chuck recognized the change immediately. His eyes registered a new respect for his opponent, not for his physical abilities, which had never been in question, but for his capacity to adapt, to grow, even in the midst of challenge. Their exchange became something rare and precious, two fighters meeting each other in the space of absolute presence, ego momentarily suspended in the purity of action and reaction. Joe's natural talent flowed without the burden of performance. Chuck's experience guided each movement with effortless precision. The crowd sensed it, their cheering softening into something approaching awe. Even those who had come for blood and spectacle recognized they were witnessing something more meaningful. A conversation in the language of combat, where respect had replaced rivalry. From his position in the front row, Master Tanaka nodded slowly, satisfaction evident in his weathered features. Now, they are both fighting, he murmured. Not performing, not dominating fighting. The final seconds ticked away. Joe launched one last attack, a perfectly executed spinning hook kick that seemed to defy physics in its speed and extension. Chuck slipped the kick by the narrowest margin, then countered with a straight punch to Joe's solar plexus, not to damage, but to demonstrate the opening in the younger fighter's defense. Their eyes met as the punch connected, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. The bell rang, signaling the end of the round. The crowd exploded into sustained applause, but it carried a different quality now. Appreciation rather than bloodlust. Respect rather than partisan support. Many were on their feet, understanding instinctively that they had witnessed something transcending normal competition. Joe and Chuck stepped back from each other, both breathing more heavily now, though Chuck's control remained evident. For a moment, they simply stood, acknowledging what had passed between them. Then Joe did something that shocked the arena into momentary silence. He bowed not the perfunctory nod he had given his previous opponent, but a proper bow of respect. The kind, traditional martial artists exchanged to honor each other's spirit. The gesture spoke volumes. In that simple movement, Joe acknowledged not just Chuck's superior skill, but the philosophy that informed it, the understanding that true power had no need for showmanship, that genuine strength revealed itself in restraint rather than dominance. Chuck returned the bow with equal formality, his expression softening for the first time. Not quite a smile, but a recognition of something valuable. A talented young fighter, beginning to understand the deeper aspects of his art. The referee stepped between them, raising Chuck's hand in victory, a formality that seemed almost unnecessary. The outcome had been clear to everyone watching, not through domination but through the quiet authority of mastery. In that moment, as cameras flashed and the crowd roared, something more significant than a victory had been achieved. A bridge had been built between two generations, two philosophies, two approaches to the ancient art of combat. And everyone present understood they had witnessed not just a fight, but a transformation, the moment when arrogance gave way to humility, when showmanship yielded to substance, when a fighter began the journey toward becoming a martial artist, in the truest sense of the word. The air in the arena seemed to thicken as the reality of the situation dawned on the crowd. What had begun as spectacle, the cocky young champion baiting the aging movie star, had transformed into something more profound. The exhibition match had become a clash of philosophies, physically manifested in the two men circling each other under the bright lights. Joe Louis stalked the ring with renewed focus. All traces of showmanship gone. The smirk that had been his trademark throughout the night had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped determination. This was no longer about putting on a show or embarrassing a movie star. It had become a fight for his identity, for the validation of everything he believed about himself. Across from him, Chuck Norris maintained his centered calm. His breathing remained even, his stance balanced and ready. Nothing in his demeanor suggested exertion or concern. Despite facing an opponent 15 years his junior and at the peak of physical prime. In the front row, Master Tanaka leaned forward slightly, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "Now we see the true test," he murmured to himself. "When the performer must become the warrior." The crowd had fallen into an expectant hush, thousands of spectators collectively holding their breath. The energy had shifted palpably from the bloodthirsty excitement of potential humiliation to something approaching reverence, the recognition that they were witnessing a rare moment of genuine martial arts philosophy expressed through combat. Joe attacked again, but with a noticeable change in approach. Gone were the flashy combinations designed as much for the audience as for effectiveness. His techniques became more direct, more functional jabs designed to test distance, feints to probe defenses. He fought now like a man who had remembered the fundamentals beneath the flash. Chuck responded in kind, his movements minimalist but perfectly timed. He slipped a jab by millimeters, blocked a cross with his forearm, and countered with a short hook that caught Joe on the shoulder, not a damaging blow, but a reminder of vulnerability. "Look at that adjustment by Louis," the announcer commented, his voice carrying over the crowd's focused silence. "He's abandoned the flashy attacks for more traditional technique." In the press section, journalists typed furiously, already composing the narrative that would fill tomorrow's sports pages. "Humbled champion learns mid-fight. Norris teaches masterclass in ring efficiency." A veteran martial arts instructor from San Francisco leaned toward his colleague. "You're watching a transformation," he whispered. Louis came in thinking this was about dominance. Now he's realizing it's about dialogue. Joe pressed forward with renewed determination, cutting off the ring to prevent Chuck from maintaining distance. It was a veteran move, showing a tactical awareness that had been obscured by his earlier showmanship. He launched a combination jab, cross, uppercut, executed with textbook precision. Chuck parried the jab, slipped the cross, and caught the uppercut on his forearm. The exchange looked simple to casual observers, but the martial artists present recognized the extraordinary timing required to neutralize such a well-executed combination. The fighters reset, circling each other with newfound mutual respect. Something had shifted in their dynamic from antagonism to recognition. Even Joe could feel it, the grudging acknowledgement that he faced a different caliber of opponent than he had anticipated. 1 minute remaining in the round, the announcer called. Joe nodded to himself, as if coming to a decision. He stepped forward with renewed purpose, launching a combination that blended his natural flash with newfound focus. A jab that flowed into an elbow strike, followed by a knee, aimed at Chuck's midsection. The sequence was beautiful in its execution, combining Joe's natural athleticism with genuine fighting efficiency. For a moment, it seemed Chuck might be caught by the unexpected shift in approach. Instead, Chuck countered with the move that had made him famous in competitive fighting, the spinning back kick. Not the theatrical version from his movies, but the functional original. Compact, explosive, perfectly timed. The kick caught Joe just below the ribs as he extended for his knee strike. The impact lifted Joe momentarily off his feet. He staggered backward, breath exploding from his lungs, eyes wide with shock, more than pain. The crowd erupted, thousands rising to their feet as one. "Incredible!" the announcer shouted over the noise. "Norris counters with his signature technique." But what happened next surprised everyone even more than the kick itself. Instead of pressing his advantage, instead of moving in to finish the exchange with a flurry of strikes that would have cemented his dominance, Chuck stepped back. He reset his stance, allowing Joe time to recover his balance and composure. The gesture wasn't lost on the martial artists present. This wasn't a sporting competition where points and victory were the ultimate goal. This was a demonstration of something more fundamental. That true mastery included not just the ability to dominate, but the wisdom to refrain when domination wasn't necessary. In the front row, Master Tanaka nodded slightly, approval evident in his weathered features. "Now he shows the true lesson," he murmured to himself. Joe recovered his balance, his expression a complex mixture of emotions, frustration, respect, determination. He had felt the power behind the kick. Controlled though it was, he understood now what he was facing. Not an aging star trading on past glory, but a man who had internalized his art so completely that it had become inseparable from his being. A camera flash caught the moment Joe's face, showing the dawning recognition. Chuck's expression calm but attentive. The photograph would appear in martial arts magazines for years afterward, captioned, "The Moment of Understanding." With 30 seconds remaining, Joe abandoned all pretense. No more playing to the crowd, no more calculated showmanship. He attacked with everything he had, not wildly, but with the genuine skill that had made him champion before ego had begun to overshadow ability. His combinations flowed with natural grace, each technique executed with precision born of thousands of hours of practice. A jab that probed Chuck's defenses, a cross that tested his reflexes, a low kick that challenged his balance, all delivered with authentic fighting spirit rather than performative flash. Chuck met the onslaught with equal authenticity, blocking, countering, moving with the economy of motion that characterized true mastery. Where Joe's previous attacks had been met with minimal response, this more genuine offensive was answered in kind. Respect for respect, skill for skill. Their exchange became something rare and precious. Two fighters meeting each other in the space of absolute presence, ego momentarily suspended in the purity of action and reaction. The crowd sensed it, their cheering softening into something approaching awe. Even those who had come for blood and spectacle recognized they were witnessing something more meaningful, a conversation in the language of combat, where respect had replaced rivalry. In the press section, A veteran sports journalist who had covered fights for 30 years leaned forward, eyes wide. "I've never seen anything like this," he whispered to his colleague. "It's like watching two different philosophies having a debate through movement." His younger colleague nodded. Fingers paused over his laptop keyboard. Lewis came in talking about exposing phonies, but Norris is showing him what's real. The final seconds ticked away. Joe launched one last attack, a perfectly executed spinning hook kick that seemed to defy physics in its speed and extension. The technique showcased everything that had made him champion: athleticism, precision, commitment. Chuck slipped the kick by the narrowest margin, then countered with a straight punch to Joe's solar plexus, not to damage, but to demonstrate the opening in the younger fighter's defense. Their eyes met as the punch connected, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. The bell rang, signaling the end of the round. The crowd exploded into sustained applause, but it carried a different quality now. Appreciation rather than bloodlust. Respect rather than partisan support. Many were on their feet, understanding instinctively that they had witnessed something transcending normal competition. Joe and Chuck stepped back from each other, both breathing more heavily now, though Chuck's control remained evident. For a moment, they simply stood, acknowledging what had passed between them. Then Joe did something that shocked the arena into momentary silence. He bowed, not the perfunctory nod he had given his previous opponent, but a proper bow of respect. The kind traditional martial artists exchanged to honor each other's spirit. The gesture spoke volumes. In that simple movement, Joe acknowledged not just Chuck's superior skill, but the philosophy that informed it, the understanding that true power had no need for showmanship, that genuine strength revealed itself in restraint rather than dominance. Chuck returned the bow with equal formality, his expression softening for the first time. Not quite a smile, but a recognition of something valuable, a talented young fighter beginning to understand the deeper aspects of his art. The referee stepped between them, raising Chuck's hand in victory, a formality that seemed almost unnecessary. The outcome had been clear to everyone watching, not through domination but through the quiet authority of mastery. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice carried over the continuing applause. "The winner, by technical display, Chuck Norris." The crowd's response was thunderous, but Chuck's reaction remained characteristically understated. He nodded once to the audience, then turned back to Joe, extending his hand. Joe hesitated only briefly before accepting it. Their handshake held none of the theatrical posturing that often characterized such moments in combat sports. It was genuine, the acknowledgement between two fighters who had shared something authentic. "You're better than your showmanship," Chuck said quietly. His words meant only for Joe. "Your skill doesn't need the ego to validate it." Something flickered in Joe's eyes. Resistance, then recognition, then the beginning of understanding. He nodded once, not trusting himself to speak. As Chuck turned to exit the ring, Joe found his voice. "Hey!" he called, causing Chuck to pause and look back. Would you show me that counter sometime?" The request contained multitudes, an admission of respect, an acknowledgement of something to learn. The first step away from arrogance toward growth. Chuck studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Tomorrow, 6 a.m. at the hotel gym. Bring your focus, not your ego." With that, he ducked between the ropes and descended from the ring, moving with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized his fighting. No theatrical exit, no playing to the cameras, just a man who had done what was necessary and now returned to his natural state of composed readiness. In the aftermath, the arena buzzed with excited conversation. People who had come expecting mere entertainment found themselves discussing philosophical concepts. Instead, the difference between fighting for others and fighting for oneself, between external validation and internal standards. A group of young martial artists gathered near the press section, animatedly analyzing what they had witnessed. "Did you see how Norris never wasted a single movement?" one exclaimed. "Everything had purpose." "And Lewis, he completely changed midway through," another added. "Started fighting for real instead of for show." "That's the difference," a third said thoughtfully. "Norris was being. Lewis was performing. Until the end, when he started being too." Near the exit tunnel, reporters clustered, hoping to catch Chuck for comments. A television journalist thrust a microphone forward as Chuck passed. "Chuck, what message were you trying to send in there?" she asked. Chuck paused briefly. "No message," he replied simply. "Just fighting honestly." "But you could have finished him earlier," another reporter pressed. "Why hold back?" Chuck considered the question. "The point wasn't to finish him," he said finally. "It was to reach him." The distinction captured perfectly what had transpired. Not a contest to determine superiority, but a communication between two martial artists, one speaking the language of substance, the other gradually learning to listen. In his dressing room, Joe sat alone, towel draped over his shoulders, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The cocky grin that had been his trademark was nowhere to be seen. Instead, his expression was contemplative, almost vulnerable, the look of a man confronting uncomfortable truths about himself. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His manager entered, already talking about damage control, about spinning the narrative to preserve Joe's marketability. "We'll say it wasn't a serious bout, just an exhibition," the manager suggested. "That you were holding back. That—" "No," Joe interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "We're not going to say any of that." "But Joe, your image—" "My image," Joe said, meeting his manager's eyes in the mirror, "is what got me in trouble tonight. I was so busy being Joe Lewis, the showman, that I forgot to be Joe Lewis, the fighter." His manager fell silent, recognizing something had fundamentally changed in his client. "When you talk to the press," Joe continued, "tell them I met a better martial artist tonight. Tell them I learned something valuable, and tell them I'll be better next time." The simple honesty of the statement represented a more significant victory than anything that had happened in the ring, the first step in a journey from performer to practitioner, from showman to student. Meanwhile, Master Tanaka met Chuck at the edge of the platform, handing him his jacket with a knowing smile. "You taught more than fighting tonight," the old master said softly. Chuck nodded, slipping on his jacket. "The best lessons aren't spoken," he replied. Together, they made their way through the buzzing crowd, leaving behind an arena forever changed by what it had witnessed, not just a fight, but a demonstration of what it meant to embody the principles that martial arts had always been meant to teach. That true power needs no announcement, that mastery speaks through silence, and that the most profound strength reveals itself not in domination, but in control. As they reached the exit, Master Tanaka glanced back at the ring one last time. "The young one has talent," he observed. "Perhaps now he will develop wisdom to match it." Chuck followed his gaze, considering the journey that lay ahead for Joe. "The hardest opponent he'll ever face," he said quietly, "is the one he's facing now." Tanaka nodded, understanding immediately. "Himself." "Himself," Chuck confirmed. The two masters continued toward the exit, leaving behind the lights and the crowd, but carrying with them the knowledge that something valuable had transpired. A moment when the true purpose of martial arts had been demonstrated not through words or demonstrations, but through the authentic exchange between two fighters at different points on the same eternal path. In the arena behind them, the crowd continued to buzz with excitement. Cameras flashed, and reporters filed their stories. But beneath the spectacle and sensation lay a simpler truth. One that would resonate long after the headlines faded. That substance always outlasts style. That mastery speaks louder than bravado. And that true power reveals itself most clearly in the ability to choose restraint when restraint is the wiser path. The morning after the exhibition, Las Vegas stirred to life with the story spreading through the city like wildfire. In hotel lobbies, at breakfast buffets, and especially in martial arts circles, the previous night's unexpected confrontation between Chuck Norris and Joe Louis dominated conversation. The Las Vegas Sun ran the headline, "Silent Thunder. Norris teaches masterclass in restraint." Sports Illustrated's reporter was already drafting a feature titled, "Beyond Flash, the Night Hollywood Met Reality." Television crews stationed themselves outside Caesar's Palace, hoping to catch comments from either fighter. But at 5:45 a.m., away from the cameras and reporters, Chuck Norris entered the deserted hotel gym. Dressed simply in a plain black G, he began his usual morning routine, stretching, breathing exercises, and the flowing movements of forms practiced over decades. His face showed no sign of triumph or satisfaction. Only the focused concentration of a man who understood that yesterday's victory was already history, and today's practice was all that mattered. The early morning light filtered through high windows, casting long shadows across the empty training space. For Chuck, this quiet moment before the world awoke was sacred, a time when martial arts existed in its purest form, without spectators or expectations. Each movement flowed into the next with practiced precision, his body following patterns ingrained through tens of thousands of repetitions over 40 years of dedicated training. At precisely 6:00 a.m., the gym door opened again. Joe Louis entered, hesitating briefly when he saw Chuck already deep in practice. Gone was the flamboyant fighter from the previous night. This morning, Joe wore a simple white t-shirt and black training pants. His expression carried a mixture of emotions, lingering pride, wrestling with newfound humility, determination tempered with uncertainty. Chuck finished his form, then turned to acknowledge Joe with a small nod. "Good morning." "Morning," Joe replied, shifting his weight uncomfortably. The confident swagger had diminished, though not entirely disappeared. "Wasn't sure you'd actually be here." "I said I would be," Chuck answered simply. The statement contained a lesson in itself. Reliability as the foundation of character. An awkward silence stretched between them, two men from different generations, different philosophies, finding themselves in an unexpected moment of transition. Joe had come as a student, a role he had not occupied in years. Chuck had agreed to teach, though not in the way he usually shared his knowledge. The weight of the previous night hung between them, not just the physical confrontation, but the philosophical chasm it had revealed. Joe cleared his throat, searching for words that wouldn't compromise his dignity, but would acknowledge what had transpired. "About last night," Joe began, then stopped, struggling to find words that wouldn't compromise his pride. Chuck waited, neither helping nor hindering the younger man's search for expression. His patience itself was instructive, the willingness to allow silence rather than filling it with unnecessary words. "I've never," Joe tried again. "That counter you used. I've never seen anything like it." Chuck nodded once. "It's not about the technique," he said quietly. "It's about the timing. And timing comes from patience," Joe finished unexpectedly. Something shifted in Chuck's expression, a slight warming, the recognition of potential beneath the bravado. He gestured to the center of the training area. "Show me your spinning hook kick." Joe moved to the indicated spot, centered himself, then executed the technique that had been the finale of his attack the previous night. Even in the early morning, without an audience, His natural athleticism was evident. The kick unfolded with fluid grace, his body rotating with perfect balance. Again, Chuck instructed. But slower. Feel each phase of the movement. Joe repeated the kick at half speed, concentrating on the mechanics. Your body telegraphs the intention before you move, Chuck observed. Here. He demonstrated with his own stance, showing how subtle weight shifts provided advance notice of the coming attack. He moved to Joe's side, adjusting the younger fighter's position with small, precise corrections. Fighting isn't about who can throw the most impressive technique, Chuck explained. It's about who can read intention most clearly and respond most efficiently. For the next hour, they worked through techniques and counters, teacher and student finding common ground in the shared language of martial arts. Joe's natural talent was undeniable. His ability to absorb and adapt, impressive. What he had lacked was not skill, but perspective. The understanding that mastery lay not in dominating opponents, but in mastering oneself. As they worked, the initial awkwardness dissolved into the focus of genuine training. Joe asked questions without defensiveness. Chuck answered without condescension. Between them developed the most authentic form of respect, that which emerges from shared dedication to something greater than individual ego. Outside the gym windows, Las Vegas was coming to life, the neon glow giving way to morning sunlight, early risers making their way through casino floors, still bearing the evidence of the previous night's revelry. But in the contained space of the gym, two men existed in a different reality, one defined by the timeless principles of martial arts rather than the fleeting nature of public attention. The problem isn't your technique, Chuck said as they paused for water. It's why you fight. Joe looked up sharply. I fight to win. Everyone fights to win, Chuck replied, his voice matter of fact, rather than judgmental. The question is what winning means to you. Joe considered this, wiping sweat from his forehead. Isn't it the same for everyone? Being better than the other guy? Chuck shook his head slightly. That's competition. It's external. True victory is internal. Being better today than you were yesterday. Your opponent is just the mirror. The concept seemed to unsettle Joe, challenging assumptions that had formed the foundation of his fighting career. He set down his water bottle, his expression thoughtful. Yesterday, he said slowly, in the ring, you could have embarrassed me, made me look foolish. He met Chuck's eyes directly. Why didn't you? What would that have accomplished? Chuck asked simply. It's what I would have done, Joe admitted, the honesty costing him visible effort. I know, Chuck acknowledged. That's the difference between fighting to prove something to others and fighting because you have nothing to prove. The statement hung in the air between them, its implications expanding beyond martial arts into life itself. Joe absorbed it silently. Recognition dawning in his expression, not full understanding yet, but the beginning of a new perspective. They resumed training, moving from technical details to the philosophical underpinnings that separated performative fighting from functional mastery. Chuck shared concepts that had guided his own development economy of motion. The relationship between breath and power. The importance of rooting techniques in practical application rather than aesthetic appeal. By 7:30 a.m., both men were drenched in sweat, the intensity of their training belying the early hour. Joe executed a combination they had been refining, finishing with the counter that Chuck had used against him the previous night. His execution wasn't perfect, but it contained something new, focus without flash, power without performance. Better, Chuck acknowledged, offering the simple praise with genuine appreciation for the effort behind it. Joe nodded, then glanced at the clock. I should get going. I've got an interview at 9. With the Post? Chuck asked, referring to the Washington Post reporter who had been covering the exhibition. Yeah, Joe confirmed, then hesitated. They'll ask about last night. Chuck met his gaze steadily, saying nothing. This was Joe's moment to choose to revert to bravado and excuses, or to embrace the more difficult path of honest self-assessment. After a long moment, Joe straightened his shoulders. I'll tell them I met a better fighter, and that I'm still learning. The simplicity of the statement, its fundamental honesty, represented a more significant victory than anything that had happened in the ring. Chuck extended his hand, and Joe took it, a gesture between equals now, rather than victor and vanquished. The journey never ends, Chuck said quietly. That's what makes it worth taking. As they gathered their gear, preparing to return to their respective worlds, Joe asked the question that had been forming since the previous night. How do you do it? Stay so calm when everything's chaos? Chuck considered the question seriously. By understanding that chaos is just a lack of perspective, he finally answered. When you stop fighting against what's happening and start working with it, that's when you find calm in the storm. They walked together to the gym exit, an unlikely pair united by the shared experience of the previous night and the morning's training. At the door, Joe turned. Same time tomorrow? He asked, the question containing both hope and uncertainty. Chuck studied him for a moment, assessing the sincerity behind the request. Then, he nodded once. Tomorrow, he confirmed. As they parted ways, Chuck to his continued morning practice, Joe to face the press and the public narrative of his defeat. Both men carried something new. Joe had glimpsed a different kind of strength than the one he had pursued his entire career. And Chuck had seen in the younger fighter's willingness to learn the most important quality a martial artist could possess: the courage to confront one's own limitations. Later that day, the exhibition's promoter approached Chuck with an offer, a rematch between him and Joe, promoted as the grudge fight of the decade, with a purse large enough to set both men up for years. They'll pay anything, the promoter insisted, dollar signs practically visible in his eyes. The footage from last night's already gone viral. Imagine what we could do with proper promotion. They stood in the lobby of the Caesar's Palace, surrounded by the opulence that defined Las Vegas: crystal chandeliers, marble floors, the constant chiming of slot machines in the background. The promoter leaned forward eagerly, his expensive suit and gold watch testament to the commercial side of fighting that had turned combat into commodity. Chuck declined with characteristic simplicity. It wasn't about money, he said. And it wasn't about spectacle. Then what was it about? The promoter asked, genuinely puzzled. In his world, everything ultimately came down to profit and loss, to spectacle and marketability. Chuck considered the question before answering. Integrity, he finally said. The integrity of the art. The word encompassed everything: the difference between performance and mastery, between external validation and internal truth, between fighting for others' approval and fighting for one's own standards of excellence. The promoter shook his head, unable to fully comprehend a perspective so different from his own. You could make millions. He tried one last time. I already have what matters, Chuck replied, ending the conversation with polite finality. That evening, in interviews across Las Vegas, Joe Louis surprised journalists with his candor. The expected excuses and bravado were absent, replaced by something more valuable: honest self-reflection. I've been fighting to be seen, he told the Washington Post reporter. Chuck Norris fights because he sees the opponent, the opportunity, the truth of the moment. That's the difference between being good and being great. And I want to be great, not just famous. The statement made headlines across the country, resonating beyond martial arts circles into the broader cultural conversation about substance versus style, about the nature of true achievement in an increasingly image-obsessed world. 2 days later, when the exhibition concluded, Chuck returned to Hollywood and his film career. Joe returned to Philadelphia and his training. But something had changed for both men, a connection forged in the crucible of public confrontation and private recognition. A shared understanding that transcended their differences. 6 months later, when Joe fought for the World Championship, his approach was noticeably different. The flashy entrances and pre-fight taunts were gone, replaced by focused preparation and quiet confidence. He won by unanimous decision. His technique still spectacular, but now grounded in functional efficiency rather than theatrical excess. In his post-fight interview, one question inevitably arose. What changed in your fighting style? Joe's answer was brief but profound. I learned that true power doesn't need a spotlight, he said. It just needs purpose. Watching the interview from his ranch in Texas, Chuck Norris allowed himself a small smile of recognition. The lesson had taken root not through domination or humiliation, but through the kind of respect that could only be earned, never demanded. The Las Vegas exhibition became the stuff of martial arts legend, remembered not for spectacular knockouts or blood-soaked drama, but for something rarer and more valuable. The moment when fighting transcended combat to become communication, when competition gave way to connection, when two men from different worlds found common ground in the timeless pursuit of mastery. But beyond the public narrative, beyond the stories retold in dojos and gyms across the country, remained the simplest and most profound truth. That strength reveals itself not in volume but in restraint, not in conquest but in control, not in what is shown to others but in what is known to oneself. In that understanding lay the heart of not just martial arts, but of a life well lived, the recognition that true power needs no performance, that genuine mastery speaks for itself, and that the most important victories are won not in rings or arenas, but in the quiet moments of choice that define who we become. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.